Hey everyone, this is Razib Khan, and I am an UNS Foundation Junior Fellow, and I blog at Gene Expression at Science Blogs.
I am David Wilson. I'm an evolutionist. I blog for Evolution for Everyone Science blog.
Cool. So, David, before I start, would you call yourself the doyen of group selection theory at this point, or multi-level selection theory? I'm just out of curiosity where you would place yourself.
Well, I would never call myself that. I think many people think of me as the Lone Ranger of group selection, but the fact is that there's a lot of us, and that's one of the things that needs to be known.
Yeah, actually, group selection has come up on Blogging Heads before. On Science Saturday, I wasn't involved, but there's a lot of controversy around it because there's a lot of confusion as to public perceptions of whether it's marginalized or not marginalized. So hopefully we'll get to some of that during the discussion.
Yeah, well, that's why I wrote my 19-part series on truth and reconciliation for group selection. And I did that after spending 35 years in the trenches. Next year is the 35th anniversary of my first paper on group selection, and it was a long-standing controversy then. So you've really got to ask why it is that what actually is quite a simple set of ideas ends up being so endlessly controversial. And that brings in cultural factors in addition to intellectual factors.
Okay, we'll get to that. So let me start with my own perspective on what I know of the history. I obviously don't know as much about the topic as you, but just as more of a general, regular person's perspective. From what I know, basically group selection theory was ascendant in the early 1960s. Vero Wynne Edwards came out with a book promoting group selection-related theories, and there was a massive counterattack from younger biologists such as W.D. Hamilton and George Williams, which kind of knocked group selection down off its perch and marginalized it for maybe 10 to 15 years. And then there was a slow crawl back. I know that W.D. Hamilton, by the 1970s, was more ambiguous or ambivalent about the topic, although, that's a little for controversy. But if you read his papers, with the price equation and whatnot, it seems like he came back from some of his extremer perspectives on group-level selection in the 1960s. And also, it was during this period, Richard Dawkins came out with The Selfish Gene. I think that was 1975.
76.
And I think that kind of set in people's minds in regards to where group selection was. But I know from reading other things and talking to people that E.O. Wilson, he always believed in group selection on some level, and more recently he's come out more proactively about it, but from what I've heard and read, he never really rejected group selection in the way that other people might have rejected it or perceived him to have rejected it.
That's about right.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead, and what do you think about, just my little summation?
Well, the one thing I'd change is that group selection was not ascendant in the 1960s. What was present in the 1960s is called naive group selection. A lot of sloppy thinking about for the good of the group, for the good of the species, so on and so forth. So the short history is that a few people, such as Darwin and the fathers of population genetics, they thought about it clearly, but not much because they had a lot else on their plate. A lot of other people were naive group selectionists. And it wasn't until the 1960s when other issues became settled by the modern synthesis and so on that group selection now could occupy center stage. And it was at that time that people like Williams and Maynard Smith and others came out strongly against naive group selection, not, by the way, reacting to Wynne Edwards only. Williams started writing his book, Adaptation and Natural Selection, in the late 1950s in reaction to what's called the Chicago School, which was a group of scientists at Chicago who were all into cooperation and harmony of nature and that kind of thing.
Was that influenced by Ali or?
Ali was one, and Emerson was another, and so Ali was a pacifist, so there's a cultural connection there. But basically thought that cooperation, as Kropotkin did before him, Kropotkin, of course, was a contemporary of Darwin, there's a thread throughout evolutionary theory that cooperation should be a principle as important as competition. Okay. And so, really, that's the thread that runs the length of the history of evolution.
Okay. Have you ever read a book, just out of curiosity, The Altruism Equation by Leon Doug Atkin?
He's my former student.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I mean, some of my like idea of the history comes out of that book and his work. So
Yeah.
anyway, I think maybe that's why there's some concordance there. So in terms of group selection and multi-level, I mean, you prefer to call it multi-level selection theory, right?
Well, here's another historical thing to get straight. Group selection has always been multi-level, and it'll take only a minute for me to describe what I call the original problem in my series of blogs. A polar bear with thick fur survives and reproduces better than a polar bear with thin fur standing right next to it. So if it's an individual level adaptation, then you simply have individuals that survive and reproduce better than others. An altruist does not survive and reproduce better than a selfish individual standing right next to it. And so if you look at social adaptations that are for the good of the group, we have a problem, which is that they're not locally advantageous. And so we have a huge problem. How do we explain traits, how a social adaptation, such as altruism, can evolve in the total population when they are locally disadvantageous each and every place that they occur? That is the central issue associated with group selection. And the answer is that these social adaptations are advantageous at a larger scale. So groups of altruists outcompete groups of selfish individuals, even though selfishness beats altruism within groups. What that does is it makes group selection inherently multi-level selection. No one would be interested in group selection if it were not for this problem of what goes on within groups. So group selection has always been a comparison of within versus between group selection. That makes it multi-level. Something that happened later was that there were more tiers were added to the hierarchy. So now we began thinking of selection among genes within individuals, or selection at the ecosystem level, or multiple tiers of groups. And so group selection was always two-tier multi-level selection, and then more tiers were added. But it's not the case that multi-level selection added something that was not present from the beginning.
Okay. So, I mean, in terms of, say, something like kin selection, inclusive fitness, where you select for you're altruistic with your kin, you consider that a form of group selection, right?
It is a form of group selection. I don't think that it's a matter of opinion.
Okay. And then in terms of the altruism, you don't, I know there's debate about this, but you don't accept something like, say, reciprocal altruism, which is more like an individual level dynamic. You don't think that could scale up, right? Well,
here's the problem, and this is why I think that a truth and reconciliation process is necessary. If you consider the original problem as I just described it, beginning with the fact that social adaptations, such as altruism, and we'll get hopefully to sort of elaborating the concept of social adaptations, because there's more to social adaptations than self-sacrificial altruism. But if the problem is that these traits are locally disadvantageous, so altruists are less fit than selfish individuals wherever they occur, there's really only one solution to that problem that I can think of, which is that these traits are advantageous at a larger scale. That means is that in some sense, group selection is the only solution to the original problem. Now, when you look at explanations such as reciprocity and kin selection, evolutionary game theory, selfish gene theory, most of these were developed as alternatives to group selection. So at that time, group selection was rejected. Let me state that clearly. The only solution to the original problem was rejected. And then these other theories were advanced as alternative. So take a hard look at these theories, and guess what? They all assume multiple groups. How could they not? If you're modeling the evolution of social behavior, it's just a fact of life that social interactions take place among sets of individuals that are small compared to the total population. They all assume multiple groups. The trait that's labeled cooperation or altruism, doesn't matter whether it's reciprocity, game theory, whatever, is locally disadvantageous within those groups and evolves only by virtue of the differential productivity of groups. And so when I go through carefully at more length in my blogs, and even more length in my academic articles, and not just me, but my my multi-level selection colleagues, is that every theory of social behavior, no matter what it's called, contains the logic of multi-level selection. And that is not a controversial statement amongst anyone who is comfortable with multi-level selection theory. And even the anti-group selectionists, when you understand carefully what they're saying, they're talking all about equivalence now. Equivalence. And so inclusive fitness theory is not an alternative to multi-level selection theory such that one can be right and the other wrong. That's how it was conceptualized at the beginning. Now it's a matter of equivalence and which formalism you might like. So the debate today seems like it's the same, but in fact it's entirely different, and that's one of the things that has to be sorted through as part of the truth and reconciliation process.
Yeah, there's a lot of there's a lot of issues there. Okay, so just in terms of like locally disadvantageous traits, there's just a question I have. I know you've done some work on behavioral morphs, just like various strategies within populations.
Yeah.
Couldn't it be that locally advantageous strategies might exhibit frequency dependence, or there's stochasticity in the environment? So, basically like changes all the time might just produce this bubble of traits that are and aren't advantageous at different times?
Well, absolutely. And let me give a little mini tutorial here on frequency-dependent selection. Again, knowing that time is short. All kinds of frequency-dependent selection. Some of it goes on within groups. And so there's plenty of examples where you simply have minority advantage. Shy and bold fish is an example. It's perfectly likely that whichever is least common has the advantage. That's a form of frequency dependence which stabilizes within groups. Stochasticity also can maintain polymorphisms, on and on and on. So lots of different kinds of frequency dependence. What altruism represents is a special kind of frequency dependence which is not stabilizing within groups. So frequency dependence means that your fitness depends on who you interact with, the frequency of your type and other types in the population. That's definitely true for selfishness and altruism, because the fitness of both depends on the frequency of altruists in the population. And yet, on a graph with the frequency of altruists on the x-axis and fitness on the y-axis, the lines do not cross. The line for the selfish type is always above the line for the altruistic type. And the lines are positively sloped, which means that everyone's fitness goes up with the frequency of altruists. What that means is there's frequency dependence, yes, but that stabilizes locally, no. And so it's only that kind of frequency dependence that necessarily requires group selection in order to provide the stabilizing frequency dependence at the larger scale. So in the total population, multi-level selection is a form of stabilizing frequency dependence. But that stabilizing factor requires the multi-group population. What's going on locally is not stabilizing. End of tutorial.
Okay, yeah, that was a lot. Let me just move to something. I don't know, maybe require another tutorial. But I mean, do you think understanding the price equation, or at least knowing the price equation, really helps out in understanding these concepts at an abstract level?
Well, that depends. Some people love the price equation. Do you know I don't use it? Because I'm not a covariance guy. Here's a chance for me to make a confession on the air here. Variances and covariances confuse me. I like causal interactions. I like thinking about a group and what's going on within a single group. Nevertheless, for Hamilton and for many other people, the price equation was a thing of beauty. And what it did for Hamilton was it showed him, in a way that his own formulation did not, that even in kin groups, even when the groups are composed of relatives, that the altruists are selectively disadvantageous compared to their selfish brethren. Just because a group is a kin group, because you're interacting with your brother doesn't mean that he might not be a selfish genotype and you might be an altruistic genotype. And that missed Hamilton missed that in his own formulation, which is why he regarded originally inclusive fitness theory as an alternative to group selection. And but the price equation made him see very clearly that that kin selection was a kind of group selection in which what the interactions among relatives was doing was basically clustering the altruists in some groups and the selfish individuals in others. Not completely, unless you're interacting with identical relatives. If they're clonal groups, then, as you know, R equals 1. You're sure that your social partner is an altruist if it's an identical twin. But in multi-level terms, what that means is that all the variation is among groups, and there's no variation within groups. Therefore, it's pure between group selection. And so that's the mapping between kin selection and group selection, which comes easily once you become familiar with equivalence and these different theoretical frameworks.
So just for viewers, R is just coefficient of relatedness, right? In terms of just,
right,
your siblings,
Yeah, but the original interpretation of R was a measure of genealogical relatedness, the probability that you share a gene identical by descent.
Yeah, exactly.
And that still floats around in the literature. But as soon as Hamilton saw his theory through the price equation, then there's also an R in the price equation, but that's like a correlation coefficient, which is basically giving you the correlation between your phenotype or your genotype and the genotype of your social partners. Again, an index of clustering for any reason, no longer just genealogical relatedness. Anything that causes heritable phenotypic variation among groups is grist, basically, for the group selection mill.
Yeah. So, we're already a little bit into this, and, you've thrown a lot out there, and it's kind of complicated. And, do you think, I've read your book from about 10 years ago, Unto Others, and I think you said in there that the parsimony, the preference for parsimony is one reason why there's resistance. Do you think, am I characterizing you correctly there?
Well, that was a major argument employed by George Williams in 1966, Adaptation and Natural Selection. And all of these arguments have a lot of inertia. You know what that means? It means that they're transmitted in an uncritical fashion, like in a cultural tradition, without a lot of thought. The parsimony is a very interesting principle in science. As you know, it's the principle that all things equal, a simple explanation is better than a complicated explanation. For parsimony to make sense in the context of group selection, all sorts of other stuff has to be in place. For example, group selection has to be complicated and implausible. Individual selection has to be simple and plausible, right? And one of the other things that became established in the 1960s was that group selection was theoretically implausible. And to read accounts today, you would think that, the parameter space was completely explored back then, and some definitive conclusion came down that group selection was theoretically implausible. That is so not the case, and as I recount in my Truth and Reconciliation series. So parsimony is not applicable if the two theories that you're testing are commensurate in terms of their simplicity and their plausibility. So, for example,
you're saying all things aren't equal.
What's that?
You're saying all things aren't equal in terms of, there's evidence for multi-level,
group selection is theoretically plausible, et cetera, et cetera. So I say it's comparable to this. Let's say you're an ecologist and you want to know whether competition or predation is more important in your species. Can you use parsimony to decide that? I don't think so. I think you have to turn to the data. And so this is the sense in which it's perfectly easy to measure within and between group selection. No problem. If you know the groups, especially in a model where you know everything, then it's completely straightforward. So you simply have to gather the right information and make a determination. Parsimony has nothing to do with it.
Okay. So would you say that some of the issue here is, in terms of multi-level selection theory, the level of selection, or the level of selection that's relevant is extremely dependent on the organism or on the species. Because it seems like, some organisms have really complex social structures, and there's stuff to explain there. Other organisms don't seem to have such complex social structures, and it seems to me that selection at a higher level would be less important in that case.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily equate levels of selection with complexity. I think something can be simple and evolved by group selection. Altruism is simple, for example. So I can imagine very complex things that are the product of within-group selection. A good example is social foraging invertebrates, what's sometimes called a producer-scrounger model, which is all within-group selection. Basically, individuals are pirating food from other individuals. And that can require a lot of brains to do that. So we have to be careful about mapping complexity onto levels of selection. But something you said earlier is absolutely correct. You have to evaluate levels of selection not only on a species-to-species basis, but also on a trait-to-trait basis within a single species. So it's perfectly possible, for example, that in a single species, two traits might be warning calls. Do you make yourself vulnerable by letting others know about a predator? And food conservation. Do you conserve your resources? Each of those are separate traits, and as you know, because you know a lot about evolution, evolutionists talk mostly about the evolution of traits, not species. A species is a bundle of traits that evolve somewhat independently of each other. And so it's perfectly possible that warning cries could evolve by group selection, and that resource conservation could not evolve by group selection in the same species. That's a perfectly plausible scenario.
Okay. Well, so I'm just going to throw something out there because it's a standard objection, and I just want the viewers to know. So there's a standard objection that group selection is it's going to be very weak vis-a-vis individual level selection, or I guess more generally you could say a higher level selection would be weaker than a lower level selection, because basically it operates slowly over generation times of the unit, right? What do you, am I characterizing that objection correctly?
You are characterizing the early argument correctly. That was indeed the consensus that emerged in the 60s. The group selection is implausible. This is an important point to make. It is theoretically possible. Nobody says the group selection is theoretically impossible. That's interesting because what it means is that everyone accepts the basic logic of multi-level selection. Williams affirmed the logic of multi-level selection and adaptation and natural selection. And then he said, oh yeah, and one more thing. Even though group selection can happen, it doesn't. So why doesn't it? Because it's so very theoretically implausible. Now, let me tell you why that's made sense then and doesn't make sense now. And it's there's many parts to this, but here's just one part. So group selection requires variation among groups. Variation is eroded by dispersal. And so you would think, so one conclusion is that you only get variation among groups when those groups are so isolated that there's very little dispersal among those groups. That's a pretty stringent condition. Therefore, group selection doesn't happen very often. Okay? So there's the argument. Not a bad argument. Here's how it fails. That argument assumes that dispersal is random. Only when dispersal is random is it a homogenizing force. What if individuals only disperse for a reason? And we know that this is even very simple organisms know to leave a patch when there's no food, when there's predators. Well, how about when there's a bunch of selfish bastards there also? And so if dispersal is contingent on the social composition of your group, all bets are off. And it wasn't until the 1990s that new theoretical models, completely plausible models, this is the kind of thing that's done best with agent-based models, and agent-based models didn't exist in the 1960s. So, but still, when you have individuals moving for reasons, then what you find is that dispersal can increase variation among groups, not decrease it, and it's a whole new ballgame. So
I see what you're saying. It's like positive feedback loops, right?
Exactly. And,
Okay,
and furthermore, if you go out in nature, just take a walk, and you'll see patchiness is everywhere. Nature is not homogeneous. And now we know about complex interactions, all sorts of nonlinearities, and so on and so forth. And variation among units, among higher-level units, is not in short supply. Or do it in the laboratory. Set up groups in the laboratory and see what happens. So
with these agent-based theories, though, again, I wonder, wouldn't it require a specific type of... I mean, are there chemical ways where really simple organisms can figure out who's altruistic and who's selfish? Because obviously we can imagine how humans can figure it out, and maybe even a lot of mammals and birds. But
if you're a water strider and a female water strider and a male jumps on you and tries to mate with you when you don't want him to, that's a good sign that he's selfish.
I see what you're saying.
So okay, I mean, his behaviors speak for themselves, right?
Yeah,
you don't need a chemical. All you need to do is interact. And once you get battered enough by selfish individuals, you just gotta leave.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
That's all it takes.
So, okay, well,
could I just make a point about this?
Yeah.
This is so obvious that it's humorous, right? I can't stop laughing anyhow. Yeah. And yet, what you find is that when these revelations began to appear, only a few years after this consensus formed, it didn't make a difference. So we need to go beyond science here and ask a few questions about such things as decision-making in general. I studied decision-making, and what you find is that in a decision-making process, people are tolerant of differences at the beginning, because that's when they're considering alternative. But they become intolerant of differences at the end when you're supposed to reach closure. And if you say, wait a minute, at the end of a decision-making process, then nobody's going to like you. That's been measured by social psychologists. And what happened at a massive scale here is that some wonderful, momentous, watershed decision supposedly happened with the rejection of group selection. And then the whole field took off in this magnificent, excelsior, individualistic direction. Yeah. And when the consensus, when the reasons for the consensus started to fall apart almost immediately, guess what? The bandwagon rolled on. And so this is one reason why we have to go beyond science in order to understand why this controversy goes on and on and on. It is in part a human process, a social process, and a cultural process in which individualism as a cultural influence, as a kind of an ideology that seeps in everywhere, is in some ways guiding the science.
Okay. That kind of jumps to something I was going to talk about later, but let's just go to that. Basically, let's just say, let's move about, 10 years ago. Let's move about 10 years ago. I didn't know very much about the topic, and what I knew about it was basically, I guess, what you would say the orthodoxy, or what people perceive the orthodoxy to be. What the kind of things Dawkins said in The Selfish Gene, or Williams said in the 1960s. And as I looked into it more, it just got more complicated. And, I found out E.O. Wilson didn't reject group selection, and then there was some empirical data which made me reconsider, I think the relatedness in some insect colonies was a lot lower than could be explained by inclusive fitness. And so it was, okay, there's something to be explained there, right? So, my own perspective has become, I guess you could say, more pluralist.
Right.
I don't know as much about the topic as you, but I try to keep an open mind. And there's definitely something that needs to be explained when it comes to humans for me, because we have really complex social structures, and I guess I will come out and say I don't buy that inclusive, that basically kin selection or reciprocal altruism can explain it all. That's why I'm interested in your work on religion and culture.
Right.
And I want to get back to that in a bit.
Good.
But when you're talking about at the level of the individual, I know some people have criticized Matt Ridley when he presents ideas of evolution for putting an individual level spin on everything, partly because he's a libertarian. Okay?
Yeah, right. Well, that's back to individualism, right?
Yeah, and so, these sorts of things do come up. And I read, W.D. Hamilton's, his collections of papers, Narrow Roads of Geneland. And there was, I mean, I really like his stuff. It's really interesting. His biography was like, especially in the second book where it couldn't get edited because he died.
Yeah.
was very interesting. Which I don't know what that says, but that it wasn't edited, and I found it a lot more interesting than the biographical introductions in the first book.
His final thing that he wrote was amazingly gloomy.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, but he said something about group selection, whereas like he basically was saying, I mean, he's a very gloomy, pessimistic person. There's a lot of politically incorrect stuff in there, but he was basically trying to say that group selection. I felt that he was trying to make an equivalence to fascism to group selection, which, I mean, that sort of stuff is. I feel like in science, people try to, put their own theories on bandwagons. Like in paleoanthropology, some people who are against out of Africa, I've seen them describe the out of Africa movement as basically a genocidal theory.
Yeah, right.
And I think they frame it that way because they know people will have an aversive reaction to genocide, right?
Sure.
And so with like group selection, and I've talked to people where they perceive group selection as being, quote, more liberal or more socialistic, okay? And yet Hamilton is showing it to be more fascistic, where it's like, when you have between group differences, there's xenophobia. And so in some of them, like, I mean, you've seen Peter Turchin's work, right? He's ecologist.
Work, yeah.
Yeah.
And so on
Turchin's work, I'm really interested in that sort of thing, and he uses group selection, obviously as a background, just an assumption. But some of that work does imply, some sort of, there are nasty dynamics in human history. It's just what it is, empirically. You know what I'm saying? And I've just seen people using these sorts of things as like, oh, well, individual level selection is Thatcherite. Like W.D. Hamilton is a Thatcherite. Or like with group selection, racial nationalists have used it for obvious reasons because, they believe between group differences and it's natural and all this sort of stuff. It's just, I mean, personally, I find it tiresome because the science is complicated and interesting enough as it is to not get too caught up in the sociology. But I was just wondering what you think of all of this because I'm sure you run into this. I mean, you kind of alluded to the issue of politics and political correctness and whatnot in Evolution for Everyone when it came to evolutionary psychology, I thought. So.
Okay, well, you guys have bucketed issues here.
Yeah, I did.
So let me try to go through them one by one and remind me if there's one that I missed. I'd actually like to begin by discussing how human thought takes place in everyday life outside of science and what you might expect from an evolutionary perspective, which is that it's Evolution 101 that if the brain is a product of natural selection, then it should form beliefs for their survival value, not for their truth value. Yes. And so the idea that we believe things and we profess them aggressively and defend them aggressively on the basis of what they might cause people to do, not on the basis of their truth value, is something that we should expect from all human thought, right?
Yeah, I see what, yeah.
But science is supposed to be different, and science is different to the extent that it's practiced successfully. Science is a cultural system for holding each other accountable for what we say. Yeah. In science, I got in trouble on my first science blog, as you know, for saying that science is a religion that worships truth as its God.
Yeah.
So it's unnatural to believe things purely on the basis of their truth content. Sure. But that's what scientists try to do. Yeah. They don't always succeed. And some of the most spectacular failures are collective because when everyone wants to believe a falsehood, then there's no disagreement that's necessary for science to operate. So there's point one. And that's why, as you say, it gets a little tiresome because when we do put our scientific hat on, then we should be evaluating things for their truth content, not for their consequences, basically.
Yeah.
Even though when we take our science hat off, then, of course, we're very interested in the consequences. Okay, There's point one. So what does the science say? Actually, science speaks very clearly on this subject. It says this. Mm-hmm. It says that all group selection does is turn groups into organisms.
Yeah.
We know what organisms do to each other.
Yeah.
Well, actually, they do a lot to each other. If you look at interactions among species, you see the full range from competition, predation, parasitism, mutualism,
yeah,
and commensalism, and just plain not interacting with each other at all. If groups became superorganisms, and group selection would be required for that, they would exhibit all of those things.
yeah.
And so therefore, let us say, which as Peter Turchin does, and I do, that we are a very group-selected species. Cultural evolution has caused those groups to become quite large. There's many groups that interact with each other in all kinds of ways. What should we expect? And what we should expect if you're a good ecologist is not invariably conflict. It is that full range of ecological interactions. And I think that's what the data says, basically. If you take a careful look at the spectrum of interactions among human groups, you do not find inevitable warfare. You find warfare a lot, and under circumstances that you can predict. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, so what is it that causes a group to function well? Again, there is both benign and horrifying possibilities. It's possible that the best functioning groups are those which are most exploitative within groups. They might slavery. They might be completely intolerant of diversity. There's all kinds of groups that might be favored by group selection, and we wouldn't want to live in those groups. There'd be something about those groups that we would call immoral. Although, I wager,
speaking of,
what's that? I wager that the people in those groups would regard themselves as very moral indeed.
Yeah,
Hitler
exactly.
did.
There are people that, out there that, they will glom onto science. You know what I'm saying? There are people that want to live in those groups. So that was what I just.
So point I like to make is that a theory has two functions. One is to describe the world the way it is and has been in the past. You can't live in this world without knowing all the nasty things that have taken place in the past and present. And so if our theory cannot account for that, then it's not a good theory. Okay?
Sure.
If a theory that tells you everything is nice is a false theory. If we have a good theory that explains the way that things have been in the past and present, then we can use that theory to make responsible moral choices in the future. And so that is the sense in which I think that group selection has all kinds of dark sides. And that's a good thing from an explanatory perspective. And then the question is, can group selection or any theory, evolutionary theory writ large, including multi-level selection theory, can it help us to make moral choices, what we regard as moral choices by consensus? Can it be a tool in our toolbox? And I think the answer to that question is yes also. I know we're going to get to the Evolution Institute and the uses of evolution to solve real-world problems by the end of our conversation. Yeah.
Okay. So, in terms of dark directions, let me just ask you, since I have you in front of me. Have you been keeping track of the direction that Kevin MacDonald has taken? Because I followed that controversy back in the year 2000 just because I was curious, and I was very skeptical of group selection at the time. Because I didn't know much about it, honestly. And it seems like he's gone in a really dark direction, and he's a scholar. So it's not just people that are mining science for their own data, right? Scholars themselves can go in directions.
Yeah. So let's see. How can Kevin was among the first people to study religion from an evolutionary perspective when it wasn't cool. In the 1990s, mid-1990s, did those books come out?
Yeah, yeah.
And he focused on Judaism. And, well, he should. So did others, such as John Hartung at the time. Judaism became like the Drosophila of evolutionary studies of religion. As well it should, because Judaism is a very strong religion. Jewish groups function as very cohesive units. And, of course, historically, Judaism is the ancestral culture for the other Abrahamic religions. And so much of what Kevin said about Judaism I think has stood the test of time. It's been elaborated. I certainly elaborated on it in Darwin's Cathedral, and and I think that this basically it's by the way, a Durkheimian view. All of these things are old and new. So in a sense, we're reviving the concept of functionalism, although in a much more sophisticated way that was initiated by early guys such as Durkheim and Weber, who are mainstays of the social literature. The concept of groups as corporate units was common sense back then, and we're returning to that common sense view. Now, so when does what Kevin says become problematic? Good question. And actually, I can't say that much about it because I haven't been keeping in touch with precisely what Kevin has said. You can inform me. But there's got to be a way. There's got to be a way in which we can study cultures as corporate units.
Sure.
Including acknowledging the mean things that they do to each other. So what that means is... go ahead.
Yeah, well, when I first encountered his ideas, I did look at them, and, as like a description, it is what it is. I don't have any issues with the description. I just know, people cite him occasionally on my weblogs. I've been blogging since the early 2000s. People cite him about the strategies groups are using, or Jews are using to suborn Western civilization, and just all sorts of strange things. Like John Derbyshire wrote kind of a negative review in American Conservative, and I think Kevin's response, this was in 2003, was basically like, look at what happens to Gentile intellectuals who are defending Jewish interests. So Kevin's idea basically is, I think he's basically come out as a white nationalist, but Gentile, not because he wouldn't, obviously he's against Jewish power. And so he's taken his ideas and become more of an applied scientist, maybe. I don't know what you could say. But obviously it's outside of the norms of the people I would interact with. And so, I encounter him every now and then, and I knew him from the whole Slate discussion. Yeah. And he definitely seems to have gone in a more obviously white nationalist direction. And I've asked him questions like, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. He seems a fine enough fellow in exchanges, but it's just he obviously has a very strong perspective on the role of Jewish power, and I think he would say that it's distorted Western culture, allowed mass immigration into the United States, all sorts of issues. But like I said, that's kind of a dark prescription, at least from the perspective of the mainstream, I would say. So why don't we just move on to the Evolution Institute, which I think it's gonna try to use evolution, right, in a way to make prescriptions that are a little more constructive from the mainstream perspective, right? Yeah,
and so I want to get a good segue there because you've raised some important issues, of course, and it's complicated in a very interesting way because when you begin to think of groups as corporate units, as entities with their own interests, basically, who might or might not cooperate with other interests, then you get all sorts of examples of exploitation, including what you could call parasitism. What's parasitism? But something small exploiting something big.
Well, plus predation. And Kevin says Jews are parasites onto what
I know it, and of course that's been a mainstay of anti-Semitism, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but let me just talk to this about as an ecologist, okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, parasitism is something small exploiting something big, right? Predation is something big exploiting something small, right?
Yeah.
So
but numerous small things, hopefully.
And so that's the exploitative end of ecological, and of course there's competition, which can be indulged by large and small, right? Now, if we expect these along with more cooperative interactions amongst human groups, then can we expect Jewish groups to be parasitic? Yes. Can we expect bigger groups to be predatory? Yes. And so what's I think makes this as benign as it can be is that we've got to share the wealth here, right? The blame. It's not as if, everyone's behaving honorably except those Jews, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's behaving dishonorably. So,
but I think, like I said, I want to move to something a little more constructive, but I think from Kevin's perspective, he is a white Gentile. And he has his own ethnic and genetic interests. That's how he views it, right?
I don't know. I have not talked to. That would actually surprise me a little bit.
Just encountering his stuff. I mean, it is cited. I don't usually let those comments through, to be honest. But I read the extracts, and that's the kind of thing that I see. I mean, it's a pretty standard framework. I mean, I've seen other people use it. I mean, it's an older framework. I mean, it's just like I said, it's resurrected in a more scientifically updated way, is what I would say. And so, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's basically like science goes through the norms that you have, right? I mean, it's like, some people will look at like a particular scientific paradigm and say, I mean, I've encountered this. Some people will look at a particular scientific paradigm and assume that it supports a left-wing political perspective, and I don't see that at all. Yeah. And I will hear other people say that it supports a right-wing political perspective.
Yeah, but you see, with the beauty of evolution here, and I know we only have a few more minutes, so and I do want to get to the Evolution Institute, but the beauty of evolutionary theory as a theory that explains humanity as well as the biological world is that it almost inherently provides an even playing field for such things as, let us say, liberalism and conservatism. Why is that? It's because those cultural forms, whatever they might be, both exist and have coexisted in an uneasy way for a long, long time. They're more common some places than others. That means that they're kind of like species, or the cultural equivalent of species. And so there's no way that evolutionary theory is going to support one, not the other. The evolutionary theory is going to explain their distribution in abundance. And then...
So you're talking ecology.
Well, that's the whole point, is that when you think of culture as an ecologist does, as an evolutionary ecologist does, then the idea that you can take something like evolutionary theory and that it provides support for a particular position, such as liberalism compared to conservatism, it just falls apart on that basis.
Okay. I mean, you're preaching to the choir there, but I agree with you. I mean, my own political views. I mean, I'll just come out and say it is like I would probably say I'm moderately conservative, actually, but I like whatever that comes out of science, and whether it's wrong or right. I mean, most of the time it's wrong. It's like most theories or most hypotheses are wrong, right? But the whole process is fascinating to me, so I don't have an issue with anything you were saying. So let's move on to the Evolution Institute. I checked out the website. It seems pretty new. How new is it?
It is less than 3 years old. And let me just briefly provide some background for the audience. So in 2003, I started a evolutionary studies program at Binghamton, which is now expanding into a consortium. And the point of that was to basically expand evolutionary training beyond the biological sciences to include all human-related subjects. That's called EVOS. And then in 2007, with a partner named Jerry Lieberman, who has experience with think tanks, we created the Evolution Institute, which is basically designed to do for the world of public policy what EVOS does for the world of higher education. Basically, we're saying evolution provides a very powerful toolkit for addressing what ails us in this world. And that toolkit is missing from politicians and their expert advisors. We're here to provide the toolkit. And so in just a few years, we've actually started in, and we've started to consider policy issues such as childhood education, risky adolescent behavior. And just recently, like 2 weeks ago, we had a fascinating conference on the nature of regulation. What can evolution tell us about the regulation of large-scale human social interactions, including financial interactions?
Yeah, I think from what I was seeing on your website, how would you say you guys relate to behavioral economics? Because behavioral economics is about the psychology of human behavior, as a lot of it has to do with how there's deviations from rational expectations, or rational expectations theory, right?
Yeah.
The rational actor.
How much more time do we have here?
We have about 10. Okay, good.
So this is exactly the kind of thing we considered. And so here's another mini tutorial here. I'll keep it real short. And this is what I learned. This is not me. I act as a moderator for this. And of course I had my own thoughts, but in my capacity as a co-director of the Evolution Institute, I'm a conduit, basically, and I function as a moderator. So what I've learned, I think what can be established, is in the first place, if you look at neoclassical economics. It began as a physics model, and it led to an enormous body of formal theory, which makes assumptions that are absurd from an evolutionary perspective, but they must be made for the formal theory to remain tractable. So here we have this, starting off in the wrong direction from the very start, and this enormous edifice of formal theory. In comes behavioral economics, who basically starts chipping away at the rational actor model and uncovers all of these anomalies and paradoxes. Okay?
Yeah.
And so behavioral economics is great. I love it. I love books like Nudge and Predictably Irrational. They're fascinating, and they take a couple of steps in the right direction. But the problem with them with the field is two things. First of all, it's inspired by psychology, not evolution, and only a narrow slice of psychology, the cognitive heuristics and biases work that stems from Kahneman and Tversky. The second problem is that all of these so-called anomalies and paradoxes are irrational only against the background of the assumptions of the neoclassical model. And an example of this, or one of the first paradoxes, is this one. Suppose I gave you a choice of $1 million for sure or $2.1 million, 50-50. You either get $2.1 million, 50% chance, or nothing. What'll you pick, okay? Now, most people would pick that sure million. I would. Yeah. And yet that's irrational. That's irrational according to the rational actor model.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. And so what hasn't been done, what behavioral economics hasn't done, with the exception of a few people who were at our conference, and those people are very good. People like Eric Beinhocker, who wrote The Origin of Wealth. Other people who are not... Okay. What's that?
Yeah, I know that book, yeah.
People who are of this school, whether they were at the conference or not, include Sam Bowles, Herb Gintis, Ernst Fair. Yeah. These are very, very well-known people.
Yeah.
But they are a minority among behavioral economists, who themselves are the minority amongst economists in general. And so what we're doing is we're saying, let's really begin from scratch here and to think about economics and especially the regulation of human social interactions from an evolutionary perspective as truly a different paradigm than the rational actor model.
Okay. Is there? What would you analogize it to? Is it more like sociology and history, or?
Well, sociology and history doesn't have a central theoretical framework.
Yeah, it's just
and so what evolution does is it has a central, powerful theoretical framework. By the way, it is not like neoclassical economics in the sense is that it cannot be represented as a body of formal theory. There's lots of theory in evolution, but it's not this kind of theorem sort of physics model, and it can't be.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of foundational insights that we need, is that actually the appropriate theory for thinking about us as a species is not the kind of formal edifice that neoclassical economics strives for. It's something else in which theory is important. But evolutionary theory is sometimes described as a toolkit. And I love that metaphor, because what it means is that you arrive at the construction site and you don't know exactly what's going to go on. You don't know exactly what tool you're going to need. It might be a mismatch situation where we're doing something goofy because we're in an environment different than our ancestral environment. Or maybe it's a multi-level selection problem in which within-group processes are taking over between group. Could be lots of stuff.
Yeah.
And so we have to figure out what's going on, and then we have to pick out the right tool. That seems like messy and pedantic compared to analytical mathematician, right? But guess what?
Yeah.
It's the only thing that's going to work. If your plumbing if your drain is clogged, who are you going to pick? A plumber or a mathematician?
Yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. Well, I mean, how have people responded? I mean, you're saying most behavioral economists don't even think in an evolutionary context, and obviously most economists, are going to be a little skeptical of this. So, I mean, where has the response come from? I mean, I'm assuming the establishment is hostile, and
well, don't say hostile. Not necessarily hostile at all. I think that I've gotten pretty good with my book Evolution for Everyone and most of what I do of making evolution alluring. And how is that possible? Back to the toolkit, is that when an idea seems threatening, then the first impulse is to kill it or to run away from it. But when an idea is alluring, the first impulse is to embrace it. And so as soon as you present evolution as providing those useful tools, and we have enough knowledge to do that right now, and we have enough expertise. I just listed some names. Just about every policy issue you might mention, there are people at the very top of their fields who have already discovered the utility of the evolutionary perspective. They want to tell you about how to use it. And so it's not as if we have to start from scratch in that sense. And so as soon as you could convince people, anyone, I don't care if they're a creationist or what they know about science or anything, that you're here to help and you have some tools, then you're their friend. And that's from high to low, from the politician to the person on the street.
Okay, so we got about 5 minutes. So in terms of the Evolution Institute, I want to ask you about education.
Yeah.
I mean, what does evolution have to tell us about education? Because it's obviously one of the big domestic policy issues in this country, and it's just a huge focus. So.
Yeah, so there's kind of two levels of insight. There's a fancy, high-level science stuff, genetic polymorphisms and hormones and neurobiology and stuff like that. But there's also
differences, right?
What'd you say?
Differences between individuals, right?
Well, that's part of it. I mean, part of it is education should not be a cookie-cutter system. It should really accommodate individual differences, not just sex differences. Sex differences are boring compared to individual differences that cut across sex lines. So one theme that emerges is individual differences. But the main point I want to get across is that in addition to the sort of high-level science stuff, there's an evolution 101 level, which is even more important. And it kind of goes like this, okay? So we're a cultural species. Our capacity for culture evolved by genetic evolution. It's very sophisticated. Given that capacity, most of what we do is transmitted by culture. The reason we have such a long life cycle is because we have so much to learn and teach. And so education has to take place in all cultures, including hunter-gatherer cultures. So the first thing you'd want to do as an evolutionist is to say, how does evolution take place in an ancestral context, right? Yeah. How do the hunter-gatherers do it? And what you find is that education is very little that resembles formal education. It's all spontaneous, and kids go around in mixed age groups. The young kids want to be like the older kids, and the older kids want to be like the adults. And the adults provide instruction when asked. It is marvelously self-organizing. And against that background, you really have to ask the question, does it make sense, our formal educational system, in the first place, to segregate kids by ages? In the second place, to have all instruction be from adults. In the third place, to divorce learning from play. And it goes on like that. Yeah. So what seems to have happened is that our modern practices have a surface logic which cause us to do things that are unnatural for our species. And I'll give you just one more example. So sexual harassment is a problem. I know. Okay. Let's have a no-touch rule. Makes sense, right? Until you realize that when people aren't touched, like many other primates, they become physiologically stressed.
Yeah. We're a grooming species, right? I mean,
exactly.
Not grooming, but
that's what Harry Harlow showed with rhesus monkeys way back in the 50s. And so we are such a cultural species, and we are so theoretically driven that put an idea in your head with a surface logic, and we just go ahead and do it, and we're oblivious to the unforeseen consequences. So, and then now put evolution in your head,
Yeah.
and you see the world in a new way, even at an elementary level. That replicated itself more recently in October at a workshop we had on risky adolescent behavior. And it's so simple in retrospect. I can tell you the main insight in a minute. Do we have a minute?
Yeah, we got like around 5 minutes, so we're not over even.
Okay,
yet,
so if you look at people who study problems in teenagers, the prevailing model is called the health model. And basically what it says is that child development takes place optimally in benign environments. And in harsh environments, development becomes handicapped, and pathologies are manifested. And so it makes sense, right? Well, from an evolutionary perspective, at a 101 level, we can say this. People have been living in harsh environments since before there were people.
Yeah.
When the going gets tough, we don't fall apart. We exhibit conditional adaptations to harsh environments.
Yeah.
And if you begin to think about the so-called problems of teenagers as strategic in harsh environments, although it's very obvious in retrospect, so much so that once you get it, you can say, how could that be possibly new? It turns out that it is a paradigm shift compared to the health model. And we can elaborate it from there. But it's so very interesting that when we consider these policy issues, every one of them, from an evolutionary perspective, the very first thing that happens is that whatever ideas that are established and their surface logic often are very different than the what becomes almost obvious from an evolutionary perspective. And so we get these foundational changes right away just from taking off one theoretical lens and putting on another.
So, you know about the law and economics movement. I mean, are you kind of thinking maybe there should be a law and evolution movement? Because some of these issues, I mean, we're just straitjacketed by legal, constraints, and, it's just, it seems like some of the stuff you're saying, it makes sense, but how are you going to implement this legally, right? We're a nation of laws, so.
Well, I think whatever gets implemented legally is what makes sense, and what makes sense depends on how you're looking at it. So I would think the evolutionary perspective would feed into any other movement. I actually have an article, my first article to appear from the Evolution Institute in a journal called the RSA Journal. It's a UK policy journal. And the title is Policy Making the Darwinian Way. And that'll be out on December 19th. I'll be publicizing it on my blog. It'll be available on the internet. But basically it says the time to start adding evolutionary theory to the policy-making toolkit is now. And 20 years is a reasonable estimate for all of us to be looking back and saying, how did we survive so long without evolutionary theory?
I mean, I'll say an amen to that. I mean, I know a lot of people are going to be extremely skeptical of that sort of thinking. I mean, you're referring to yourself as an evolutionist, which is a lot of evolutionary biologists don't like that term, I think, because it seems too general, as if you can apply evolution to everything. And it's not just in science that I think people are going to, people resist this sort of thing, right? I mean,
yeah, because they think it's totalizing, was the way a postmodernist would put it. They think it's exclusionary, when in fact it's just the opposite, because every major perspective, unless you're a creationist, is something which can become integrated into evolutionary theory. And you're absolutely right that evolutionary biologists respect the boundary between humans and non-humans as much as people on the other side. That's an apartheid that's respected on both sides, something I've often noted to my amusement. But nevertheless, I think that the way to frame it in a way to make very fast progress, and that's why I think the Evolution Institute is so important, is that as soon as you show an idea to be useful, at the very end of my article I say that the reason that we all believe in physics and chemistry is not because they're better supported by empirical evidence, it's because we use them every day of our lives. We can't fly airplanes without them. As soon as evolution becomes that useful for public policy, then there will be a transformation in its acceptance. And it could happen very fast. So I'm actually quite optimistic about that.
So, I mean, I've heard it said when science becomes engineering, there's no way you're going to reject science, right? So,
Exactly.
I mean, is that what you're thinking? Okay.
Yeah, and
okay, I mean, like, I'm on board. I'll give you an amen to that, but I think a lot of people are going to be uncomfortable, but maybe that's what needs to happen.
Well, let the wild guckas start. I mean,
yeah.
We'll have a good conversation about that, won't we?
yeah. Okay, so we're about out of time. I think we talked about a lot of issues, and I will probably see you online. Definitely check out David's blog. He's got the best subdomain on science blogs, in my opinion. It's scienceblogs.com/evolution, which I would like to have that subdirectory, actually.
I didn't even ask for it.
I know, but they gave it to you. But in any case, it was great talking to you, and I'm gonna keep track of your. Are you coming out with any new books? I'm just out of curiosity.
I'm just finishing a book called "Evolving the City: An Evolutionist Contemplates Changing the World One City at a Time," and it's all about how evolution can be used to make a difference in the real world.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I'll definitely keep track of that, and let's keep in touch, David.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Take it easy.